my name is Travis Legletter with the Purdue Weed Science program, and today I'm going to be giving you a short presentation on how to use the corn and soybean herbicide chart. And what we're going to talk about a little bit today is the layout of this chart and how we at Purdue Science would like you to use this chart to outline your herbicide program and the number of sites of action that you're using and the rotation of those sites of action. So the first thing to start off with is just to talk about what is the corn and soybean herbicide chart. So this is a tool that was created by the Glyphosate Weeds and Crops Working Group, and it was a tool that was designed to help producers see what sites of action they're using and see what the rotation of those sites of action are. Now, if you do not have this chart, you can get a copy of this chart by going to this link here. It'll take you directly to the PDF or directly download that PDF of the chart. Now, traditionally, this chart is printed on a sheet of paper that's 11 inches wide and 24.5 inches long. So most of you are not going to have printers that can print this or even the paper to print it on. But what you can do once you download the PDF is you can print it out on 2 sheets of paper, regular 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper in portrait, or you can print it out on the same size paper in landscape on 3 of those sheets, and that's going to kind of give you the same dimensions as what is printed out on hard copies that the universities have been distributing. It'll also be helpful to you if you can print this out in color, as there is a color coding scheme on this. So again, this is a chart that we're going to be talking about today, and it's going to be very helpful to you if you have a copy of one of these charts in front of you. It'll be very helpful in using this chart in the demonstration of this chart. So again, these charts were widely distributed by university scientists, but a lot of times what we saw here at Purdue is if we handed out these charts and didn't really give a lot of instruction on how to use them, producers tended not to use them because there's an overwhelming amount of information that's packed into this small document or relatively small document, and it can be very complicated if it's not explained to producers on how to effectively use this. So we really stressed this past year on how to use this chart and get across to producers how they should be using this chart, and this is really just an extension of that. So the first thing that we need to do, the first thing I really think we need to clear up is what's the difference in a mode of action and a site of action. I think all too often these two terms are interchanged or even confused, and people aren't sure which one's which, or which one they should be looking at, or which one they should be talking about. And so what we'll do really quickly is clarify what's what. So the mode of action is the effect of the herbicide on plant growth and the eventual death at an effective dose. So a lot of times this is what we think of as the visual symptoms on the plant. So the mode of action is just how it affects the plant. The site of action is the specific enzyme site or pathway that the herbicide is binding or inhibiting to create that plant growth effect. So you can kind of think of the sites of action as more specific, and a lot of times they're subsets of those modes of action. So if we look, we can see that some of the modes of action only have one site of action. So our lipid synthesis inhibitors actually only have one site of action. That's the ACCH inhibitor. So specific enzyme that's inhibited at the site of action that creates that mode of action or that effect on the plant growth. Whereas we looked at the cell membrane disruptors, again, that's the mode of action or the effect on the plant. There's 2 separate sites of action. You have the PPO inhibitors, the group 14, and the photosystem 1 electron diverters, the group 22s. So these are 2 separate sites of action, completely independent sites of action, but they both cause the same effect on plant growth. So they're both in the same mode of action, but 2 separate sites of action. And because of this, we really strive to have producers rotate their sites of action rather than their modes of action. Your site of action is more specific. There's more sites of action. And this chart, it does kind of start off by a mode of action. It does have the modes of action on there, but it's really based around the sites of action and the site of action groups, and we'll talk about those sites of action. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of talk about the chart layout. How is this chart completely laid out? And the first thing you can do is take this chart and to break it down a little bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to break it down by the mode of action chart. So there's one part of it that's by mode of actions, and then there's a second chart, by premix chart. And so you can see those 2 breakdowns. If you look underneath that black heading, the first table is going to be that by mode of action table, and that table falls again underneath that black heading on the left hand side of the document. And then you'll see there's a separate table, an independent table on the far right hand side that takes up the entire length of the document called the by premix table. So these are 2 independent tables, yet they are linked together and they will be used together. So we'll talk about each one of these independently. And we'll start out by the by mode of action chart. We'll start off by talking about this. So the by mode of action chart, if you look, and now we're just going to look right at that chart specifically, kind of pulled it out. So again, that's the chart that's underneath that black header on the left hand side. And if you look on the right hand side of this chart, there's two columns. Alright, and on the far right hand side it says product examples, and in parentheses it says trade names. So these are product names that are out there, and these are all products that have one active ingredient in them. And if you look on that next column directly to the left, it says active ingredient. So that's going to be the active ingredient that's in that product example. And so these are kind of randomly thrown in there. They seem to be randomly thrown in there. There's not a lot of rhyme or rhythm, but really there is, and we'll see that as we move to the left. So we go over one column to the left, and you'll see it says chemical family. So this is the chemical family, the chemical structure, and this is the first way that these are organized. So all those product names on the right hand side, the first thing they are is they're organized by their chemical family. As we move to the left, they're further organized by their site of action. Alright, and then we move further to the left, and they're even more further organized by their mode of action. So as you can see, if you start over on the right hand side, it's the independent products, their independent active ingredients, and they're solely grouped together by their chemical family, their site of action, and lastly by that broad category of the mode of action. Also on this chart, you'll see these black dots all the way down through there next to each site of action, and in that dot is a number. That is the number of resistant weeds in the United States to that specific site of action. So this kind of give you a reference on the inference of resistance to those sites of action. So those with the rather high numbers, that's showing that that site of action, if you put selection pressure on it, will become resistant fairly quickly. And also you'll see in the boxes here, there's a line of boxes here that have numbers in them. That is the site of action group number. So what this is each site of action has been given a numerical value by the Weed Science Society of America, and each one has its own independent numerical value. And why they did this is to simplify things. Basically, rather than making you guys memorize all your sites of action, these complicated scientific names, essentially they give each one a number. It's for ease of recognition and ease of use. You can just write down a number rather than these cumbersome, confusing site of action names. Just write down a number and it's much easier. The next thing you'll notice is that there's a color coding scheme here. Alright, so each mode of action, again, that's the effect on plant growth. That's the more broad category on the far left. Each one has its separate color. So you start at the top with the lipid synthesis inhibitors, and they're blue, and you work your way down, and each mode of action will have a different color until you get to the very bottom with those ciliate shoot growth inhibitors that are in the brown. Alright, and then if you look within those modes of action, the modes of action with separate sites of action, you'll see that there's different shades of that color within each mode of action for those sites of action. To give you a specific example, we'll blow it up a little bit here, and we'll look in at the growth regulators. So that's kind of the purple color there that the growth regulators are, and you'll see that the growth regulators bracket in two sites of action. That'd be the group 4 and the group 19, and you'll notice the 4 is a different shade of that purple than the 19. You also see that with the photosynthesis inhibitors. With the photosynthesis inhibitors, there's 3 sites of action, and you'll see that that's group 5, 6, and 7, and those all have their own shade of green, where green is the mode of action color. So this is kind of the color coding scheme that this chart follows, and you'll see how this links this chart, the by mode of action chart, to the by premix chart. Just to give you a little bit of an example, the first thing we're going to do is just kind of how we use this by mode of action chart. So if there was a product that you're using and you knew it only had one active ingredient, let's say permit. So you say, I want to know what permit is, I want to know more about it, and I want to know what site of action is. So you would find it, again, look under the product examples column, you go down that column until you find permit. Again, it may take you a little time because there's not a lot of because they're not really in alphabetical order or anything. But if you go down, you'll see it's the third product down underneath that green, that puke green kind of line there. Okay, so once you find permit, if you move over to the left, you'll see that the active ingredient is halosulfuron. So the other thing that you could have done is you could have went to your permit label and you could have looked on the label on the front page. It's going to have the active ingredients. You could have found what the active ingredient was. You could have found that it was halosulfuron, and you could have looked it up that way as well. So once you find your product and its active ingredient, you just keep moving over to the left. You'll see that its chemical family is the sulfonylureas. You keep moving over. You'll see that the site of action is ALS inhibitors, and that site of action group is the 2s. And then lastly, you can see that your mode of action is the amino acid synthesis inhibitors. Now, we'll also see here in the black dot that the ALS inhibitors, that's the site of action that the permit is in. You'll see that there's 44 known or ALS resistant weed species. Alright, so that's just kind of a for your information kind of thing. So the one thing when you're looking up these products and the way we want you guys to be using these charts, the things you're really going to be paying attention to is either looking it up by its trade name, that would be permit, or its active ingredient, which would be halosulfuron, and then lastly, you'd be looking for that site of action number. Again, just writing down the number is good enough rather than writing down the long, complicated scientific names. Just write down that site of action number. So for this one, you'd write down that permit is the site of action number 2. Alright, so moving on from here. Let's go talk about the bi-premix chart. Again, the bi-premix chart is the chart on the right-hand side of the document that takes up the entire length of that document. And the reason why we have this chart separately is that there's many products out there, trade name products, that don't have a single active ingredient. Most of our trade name products, most of our products are actually premixes that have multiple active ingredients in there. Rather than making you break down the ingredients and looking them up all in the by mode of action chart, we kind of helps you out a little bit by creating this bi-premix chart. So the way this bi-premix chart is organized is on the left-hand side of that chart is the name of those premixes, the trade names, and it's in alphabetical order. So this is pretty handy, really, to have these in alphabetical order. Go down there and find your product. Now, as you move over to the right, you'll see that the component, it breaks down each of those premixes by their components. First, by the trade name of those components. Secondly, by the active ingredients of those components. And then it further breaks them down to the site of action groups of each of those components. And then lastly, you'll see that there's these colored bars next to each one of those components. And those colored bars are going to be what links us back to that bi-mode of action chart. So if we pull back out and look at the entire chart, if you look at the very top of the bi-premix, at that first premix product, which is going to be Anthem, you'll see that there's a light brown bar and there's a dark red bar. So those colors can connect you back to the bi-mode of action chart. So the light brown bar, you can see it connects you back to the site of action group number 15s. And then you can see that the red bar will link you back to the site of action numbers 14. So that's one way that we can link between these two charts, is by those colored bars on the bi-premix chart, link you back to the color coding system of the bi-mode of action chart. The other thing that you can look at is you can link between the two charts simply by using the site of action group number. So again, you see the numbers there in the bi-premix chart. Those numbers, you can find the numbers for your premix there. You can bounce back over to the bi-mode of action chart and look at those there. You can also do it by active ingredient. Active ingredients of the component, okay? This won't be nearly as fast, but you can link them that way, as well as by the trade name. So there's several different ways you can link these together, again, by using the colors or just the site of action group numbers themselves. So it's probably going to be the quickest way to link back and forth between these two charts. So the way we'd use this bi-premix chart, again, just look at the very top there. You have Anthem. So what we see as we move across is it has two components. Okay, the first component is Zidua, which is the active ingredient pyroxasulfone, as the site of action group number 15, and again it has that light brown bar that connects you back to that bi-mode of action chart. And then the second component you'll see is Cadet. You'll see that its active ingredient is fluticethyl, and its site of action group is 14 with the dark red bar, again, that links you back to that bi-mode of action chart. So this chart is fairly straightforward in the way it's organized. Again, those trade names are in alphabetical order, and they break down the components for you. So if you're ready to use this, really, the way we want you to use it, you just look up your bi-premix, go across, find your site of action groups, and write down those groups. Alright, so So let's talk a little bit about outlining your herbicide program. So what we want you to do with this chart is to really see how many sites of action you have in your program, how much are you rotating your sites of action, and how can you improve that site of action rotation. What we want you to do is write down what your program is going to be for the next season for your soybean or for your corn acres. And if you want, sit down and write out 2 years in a row, and you can really see how many site of actions you're rotating and how many site of actions you're doing. So again, sit down with your program, write it down, and then use this chart to look up each of those products and write down the site of action number for those. So we'll kind of run through this, how you would do this with one program. The one thing we want you to look for once you write down all your site of action numbers that you're using in one season, or if you want to extend it out for 2 seasons, is we want you to look at the number of sites of action that you've used. Now, not only do we want you to look at that, we want you to look at the number of effective sites of action that you've used. And when I say effective sites of action, if you have a resistant weed, if you're spraying that site of action on that weed, it would not be considered an effective site of action. So for example, if you're spraying an ALS resistant population of water hemp, for example, if you're spraying one of those and you write down your program and you write down your sites of action for that program, and you have in there 5 sites of action, but one of them is a site of action group 2, which is ALS inhibitors, and again, it's an ALS resistant population. You would not count that as an effective site of action because that's not being effective on that resistant population. So you would go to saying you have 4 effective sites of action. So that's really what you need to look at, is the effective sites of action rather than the total number of sites of action. And then lastly, we want you to look at the selection pressure you're putting on any given site of action. So if you're spraying any site of action more than 2 times in a growing season, we would consider that significant selection pressure that you're placing on that site of action. And if there is a site of action you're only spraying 2 times in that season, we want you to think about the next season and not applying that site of action to next season, because if we're applying it 2 times in one season, we really need to back off using it the next season and really pull the pressure off of it. So our example here is going to be we're looking at a program to control Palmer amaranth and no-till soybeans, and this Palmer amaranth is ALS and glyphosate resistant. So I'm going to do a burn down. Again, it's no-till soybeans. I'm going to do a burn down of Gramoxone plus Syncor, and I'm going to throw in Sonic as my residual. I'm going to come back early post prefix because I know that has effectiveness on emerged weeds as well as it has some residual to it. I'm going to come back late post with Cobra for a cleanup. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this program, use our chart to find out what our site of actions are for each one of these. So first of all is Gramoxone. So if you look, that's down towards the bottom of the biomotive action chart. This is a single ingredient product. So if you look down there, it's in the red section, in the kind of lighter red section. You'll see that its active ingredient is paraquat. If you move over, you'll see in the light red box there, its site of action group is 22. So you'd write down 22. Moving on to Syncor. We'll look and see Syncor. It's in the green section of your biomotive action chart. Again, this is a product that only has 1 active ingredient. Its active ingredient is metribuzin, and you'll see that its site of action group is number 5. So you'd write down the 5. Moving on, Sonic. Sonic is a premix. So this is going to fall over in the right-hand side in that by premix chart. And again, those are in alphabetical order. So you get down towards the bottom there in the S's, you'll find Sonic. You'll see that it's a mixture of sulfentrazone and chlorantranilium, and that site of action groups 14 and 2. So you'd write down the 14 and the 2. Moving on to prefix, another premix. Again, in that premix, it's in alphabetical order. You'll see that it's S-metolachlor and a foamicifin. So your site of action group number is going to be a 15 and a 14. So you'd write down those 2 sites of action. And then lastly, Cobra. It only has 1 active ingredient in it, and that's lactofen. And you'll see that in the red section, in the dark red section, and you'll see that the site of action number is 14. When we get all done with writing this all out, again, I went through that rather quickly because I prepared this ahead of time, so this may take you a little more time than that to go down through here and find all those in that chart. But just take a little bit of time and write down all those sites of action. Once we start looking through here, we're just going to look at those site of action group numbers. So what we can see here is we can see that we have 5 sites of action. That's pretty good. Only 4 of those are effective sites of action. So the one that's not effective, again, this is an ALS and glyphosate resistant population. So that chloranthalum that's in Sonic, that site of action group number is 2, so that's an ALS site of action, so that is not an effective site of action. We only have 4 effective sites of action. Now the next thing to look at is, okay, I have 4 effective sites of action, that's pretty good, but if we start to look through this program, you'll notice one thing that's a little alarming, and that's the number of 14s that are occurring, the number of site of action 14s that are occurring. So there's 3 of them. We're applying the site of action group 14, that's our PPO inhibitors, 3 times in this growing season. So we're putting significant selection pressure on this site of action and pressure to make that Palmer amaranth resistant to the PPO inhibitors or site of action number 14. So what we want to do is rethink this program, rethink how we really want to apply this program, take the pressure off that site of action group number 14. One thing that we could do is we could switch to LibertyLink soybeans and spray Liberty, spray 2 passes of Liberty behind that. So we'd have Liberty, we'd throw in our dual as a residual, so that's keep that 15 in there, and then follow it up again with a late post to clean up with another pass of Liberty. Now, if you're going to do this, again, remember I said if you're going to be spraying 2 passes of any site of action, be careful about going to that the next year. So if you were to do this the next year, if you rotated the corn, you would have to be careful and try to go with something that does not contain Liberty or that site of action group number 10. The other thing that you could do is you could go in here and you could say, okay, I'm going to spray Liberty as my early post, and then I'm going to come back late and clean up with that Cobra. So again, you're spraying 2 passes at 14, you don't have that significant selection pressure like we did originally, and then if you rotate the corn the next year, there's not a lot of PPOs we spray in our corn, so there's a good chance you're not going to be spraying that in your corn the next season. And again, that's where it goes back to, it's always a good idea to get this season as well as next season and see what your overall rotation is in your sites of action and just how many sites of action you're using between your corn and your soybean. There's a lot of options we can use here. Again, the big thing is just make sure you're not putting significant selection pressure on any given site of action, and that'll reduce the amount of future resistance that we're going to have to deal with. And the more sites of action that we can keep in this program, the better off we are at controlling these weeds and preserving the sites of action that we have left to us, especially in soybeans. That's really all I have for going through the corn and soybean herbicide chart. That's the complete layout of it, how we want you guys to use it. Another good resource for you guys to use is the weed control guide. So the one thing this chart doesn't tell you is which one of these products is for corn, which ones are for soybean. So if you want that information, you can go to the weed control guide, the Ohio and Indiana weed control guide that's updated annually, as well as this weed control guide will tell you which one of these herbicides control what weed. So you can use these 2 resources in conjunction, build your herbicide program, and build the number of sites of action that you're using and the rotation of your sites of action. I thank you for your time, and feel free anytime to send your questions to myself or Dr. Bill Johnson if you have any further questions on these subjects.